The Texas sky over the Lazy E Ranch was a bruised purple, the kind of sunset that felt less like a promise and more like a closing door. Evelyn Carter stood on the wraparound porch of the white-clapboard farmhouse, her knuckles white on the railing. The last of the mourners' trucks had kicked up a final plume of red dust an hour ago, heading back toward the dim lights of Sterling, population 1,842. The air still smelled of casserole and cheap perfume, a cloying scent over the familiar, honest odors of sun-baked earth, hay, and cattle. For 25 years, this had been her view. For 25 years, she had been Evelyn Carter, wife of Hank. Now, at 58, she was just Evelyn. A widow. The word felt like a burr in her sock, small but impossible to ignore. Hank's heart attack had been as sudden and brutal as a summer hailstorm. One minute he was arguing with the feed supplier over the phone, his voice a familiar, gravelly roar in the next room. The next, there was a thud. Silence. Now, he was in the ground next to the little family cemetery plot where her own parents rested. The ranch, a sprawling 5,000-acre spread of rolling pasture, live oak mottes, and a crucial stretch of the Clear Fork River, felt cavernously empty. The first letter came 3 days after the funeral. It was formal, printed on crisp, expensive stationery from a law firm in Dallas she'd never heard of, Bishop and Thorne. It was addressed to the estate of Henry J. Carter. Her hands, calloused and strong from a lifetime of work, trembled only slightly as she slit the envelope. It was a notice. A demand, really. For payment on a line of credit. A line of credit she had never signed for, secured against the ranch's northern pasture. The sum at the bottom made her stomach drop to her boots, $287,500. A mistake, she whispered to the empty kitchen, the hum of the ancient refrigerator her only reply. Hank handled the money. He'd been an accountant before inheriting his share of his family's oil service business, which he'd sold to buy into the ranch when they married. "You keep the land happy, Evie," he'd always said, kissing her forehead. "I'll keep the books happy." She spent the next morning in Hank's office, a room she'd rarely entered. It smelled of his cigarillos and lemon wood polish. The filing cabinet, a hulking metal beast, was locked. She found the key taped beneath the center drawer of his massive oak desk. As she pulled the first drawer open, a cold dread, deeper than grief, began to seep into her bones. A mistake, she whispered to the empty kitchen, the hum of the ancient refrigerator her only reply. Hank handled the money. He'd been an accountant before inheriting his share of his family's oil service business, which he'd sold to buy into the ranch when they married. "You keep the land happy, Evie," he'd always said, kissing her forehead. "I'll keep the books happy." She spent the next morning in Hank's office, a room she'd rarely entered. It smelled of his cigarillos and lemon wood polish. The filing cabinet, a hulking metal beast, was locked. She found the key taped beneath the center drawer of his massive oak desk. As she pulled the first drawer open, a cold dread, deeper than grief, began to seep into her bones. A mistake, she whispered to the empty kitchen, the hum of the ancient refrigerator her only reply. Hank handled the money. He'd been an accountant before inheriting his share of his family's oil service business, which he'd sold to buy into the ranch when they married. "You keep the land happy, Evie," he'd always said, kissing her forehead. "I'll keep the books happy." She spent the next morning in Hank's office, a room she'd rarely entered. It smelled of his cigarillos and lemon wood polish. The filing cabinet, a hulking metal beast, was locked. She found the key taped beneath the center drawer of his massive oak desk. As she pulled the first drawer open, a cold dread, deeper than grief, began to seep into her bones. A mistake, she whispered to the empty kitchen, the hum of the ancient refrigerator her only reply. Hank handled the money. He'd been an accountant before inheriting his share of his family's oil service business, which he'd sold to buy into the ranch when they married. "You keep the land happy, Evie," he'd always said, kissing her forehead. "I'll keep the books happy." She spent the next morning in Hank's office, a room she'd rarely entered. It smelled of his cigarillos and lemon wood polish. The filing cabinet, a hulking metal beast, was locked. She found the key taped beneath the center drawer of his massive oak desk. As she pulled the first drawer open, a cold dread, deeper than grief, began to seep into her bones. A mistake, she whispered to the empty kitchen, the hum of the ancient refrigerator her only reply. Hank handled the money. He'd been an accountant before inheriting his share of his family's oil service business, which he'd sold to buy into the ranch when they married. You keep the land happy, Evie, he'd always said, kissing her forehead. I'll keep the books happy. She spent the next morning in Hank's office, a room she'd rarely entered. It smelled of his cigarillos and lemonwood polish. The filing cabinet, a hulking metal beast, was locked. She found the key taped beneath the center drawer of his massive oak desk. As she pulled the first drawer open, a cold dread, deeper than grief, began to seep into her bones. Kyle, tanned and restless, fiddled with his phone. Yeah, efficient. This is a prime piece of real estate. River frontage like this? Developers would salivate. Evelyn stood her ground, her back straight, wearing her best jeans and a pressed shirt. The ranch isn't for sale. It's my home. It was my family's home. Jason's smile didn't reach his eyes. We understand your sentimentality, Evelyn. But the financial realities. Dad's debts are substantial. They're secured against the property. His property. The will is clear. We have a fiduciary duty to see his wishes carried out. He used the legal terms like weapons. We're prepared to make you a fair offer for your half interest, so you can walk away with something. A clean break. A clean break. From the land her great-grandfather had homesteaded after the Civil War. From the oak tree she'd climbed as a girl, the river where she'd learned to swim, the soil that held the bones of her parents. Rage, hot and clarifying, burned through the numbness. Get off my land, she said, her voice low and steady. Melissa scoffed. Your land? That's a matter of perspective, and soon, of law. You heard her. The new voice came from the screen door. Luis Garcia, her foreman for 15 years, stood there, his Stetson in his hands, his presence solid and unwavering. He was flanked by two of his nephews, both big, quiet men who worked the cattle. They hadn't been invited, but they'd seen the fancy cars. Luis met Evelyn's gaze and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. We're here. The stepchildren exchanged glances. The dynamic had shifted. This wasn't just a lonely widow anymore. This is a private family matter, Jason said, his voice losing some of its polish. The Carters are family, Luis replied evenly. The ones who work this land. You best be going now. They left, but the threat lingered in the dust behind their tires. Evelyn knew she was outgunned. She needed a lawyer, but the only one in Sterling was old Jim Barnett, who'd done her parents' wills and was more comfortable with property lines than probate warfare. He confirmed her worst fears after a grim review. It's ugly, Evie. Hank played it clever. Texas is a community property state, but he's argued a lot of this was his separate capital. Those debts are real. His kids have a strong case. I'm not the man for this fight. Desperate, she drove to Fort Worth, sitting through consultations with 3 different law firms. They saw an older woman from a rural town, a complicated case with pre-existing debt, and opponents with deeper pockets. Their retainers were astronomical, their timelines long, and their demeanor was one of polite pessimism. She left the last office feeling smaller than she ever had, the towering glass buildings of the city seeming to mock her. On a whim, fueled by despair, she stopped at a small, modern storefront law office near the courthouse. The sign read, Reyes and Associates, LLC. It looked new. Inside, the reception area was bright, with a single desk. Behind it, a young woman with fierce dark eyes and her hair in a sleek bun was typing furiously. She looked up. Can I help you? I need a lawyer, Evelyn said, the exhaustion clear in her voice. You found one. Sophia Reyes. The woman stood, extending a hand. She couldn't have been 30. What's the problem? An hour later, Evelyn had spilled the entire, sordid tale. Sophia listened intently, taking notes on a tablet, asking sharp, precise questions. When Evelyn finished, Sophia leaned back. They think you're a easy mark, she said, her voice firm. A widow, rural, no financial sophistication. They're using procedure and paperwork to bully you. But Texas law has protections. The homestead exemption is powerful. And a spouse's undue influence on estate planning, especially in secret, is a fight we can make. She looked Evelyn directly in the eye. I graduated top of my class from UT Law. I worked 2 years at a big corporate firm in Houston and hated it. I moved here to take on cases that matter. I can't promise you we'll win. And I can't work for free. But my rate is half what those downtown suits charge, and I will fight for you like this land is my own. Do you want to fight, Miss Carter? Evelyn saw no pity in Sophia's eyes, only a fierce, determined intelligence. It was the first spark of hope she'd felt since finding the files. It's Evelyn. And yes. I want to fight. The battle lines were drawn. Sophia filed a blizzard of motions, to challenge the validity of the new will based on Hank's secretive actions and potential lack of capacity, to assert Evelyn's homestead rights on the entire property, to demand a full accounting of all the separate assets and the mysterious debts. The stepchildren retaliated. They secured a lien against the ranch, freezing its operations. They petitioned for an emergency receiver to be appointed to manage the estate's assets, which would have put a stranger in charge of Evelyn's home. They spread whispers in Sterling that Evelyn was emotionally unstable, trying to dishonor Hank's memory out of greed. The legal war was a slow, draining torture of depositions, hearings, and paperwork. But the war on the ground was immediate. The ranch was a living thing that couldn't be put on hold. The cattle needed feed. Fences needed mending. Taxes were due. One afternoon, a truck from the local feed co-op was turned away at the gate. Accounts frozen, the driver said apologetically. Orders from the estate's lawyer. Evelyn stood in the yard, feeling the walls close in. That evening, as she sat at the kitchen table staring at unpaid bills, headlights swept across the window. It was Louise's truck, but it was followed by 3 others. Buck O'Neill, her grizzled neighbor to the west, got out. So did Maria Flores, who ran the diner in town, and Reverend Clark from the non-denominational church. They came in, filling the kitchen with their solid presence. Buck placed an envelope on the table. The boys and I had a spare load of hay. It's in your barn. Maria set down a massive pot of menudo. For your freezer. You need to eat. Reverend Clark, a practical man of few words, simply said, "My nephew's a paralegal in Fort Worth. He's doing some research for your Miss Reyes, pro bono." Louis spoke last. "The Garcia family has worked this land for 3 generations, Evelyn. We're not employees. We're part of it. We'll work for room and board until this is over. The cattle will be tended. The land will be kept." Tears, the first real ones since Hank's death, finally came. Not tears of weakness, but of a profound, humbling gratitude. She wasn't alone. Sophia, working out of Evelyn's guest room during long weekends, became a detective. She subpoenaed bank records, tracked the flow of money. The story that emerged was both pathetic and enraging. Hank, it seemed, had never shaken the need to buy his children's affection. Jason's real estate ventures had constant cash flow gaps. Melissa's lifestyle was funded by investments. Kyle's schemes were bottomless pits. Hank had been their silent, desperate ATM. As his own savings from the oil service sale dwindled, he'd started borrowing, using the ranch as collateral, hiding it from Evelyn. The revised will was his final, tragic attempt to secure their future with the only thing of value he had left, his share of her heritage. Sophia also found something else. A pattern. Several of the largest loans were from a private lender called Lone Star Capital Partners. Digging deeper, she discovered Lone Star was a shell company. And its registered agent was an old business associate of Hank's, who was also Jason Carter's silent partner in several Houston developments. "It's a sham," Sophia told Evelyn, her eyes blazing with triumph. They were loaning Hank money, at usurious rates, knowing he'd use the ranch as collateral. They were setting the whole thing up. They weren't just entitled heirs, they were active predators. This moves it from contested probate to potential fraud. At the next court hearing, a mandatory mediation, Sophia laid out the new evidence. She didn't yell. She spoke with cold, forensic clarity, presenting the paper trail that connected Jason to the predatory lender. Jason's smug facade cracked. This is outrageous speculation. The court-appointed mediator, a retired judge, peered over his glasses. It's a compelling pattern, Mr. Carter. One a jury might find very interesting. It also casts significant doubt on the undue influence being on your father, and suggests a possible conspiracy to defraud a surviving spouse. Melissa, who had been silent, looked at her brother with dawning horror. She was entitled, but she wasn't stupid. She saw the prison bars of scandal and a protracted, public court battle looming. Carl just looked sick, realizing his meal ticket might vanish entirely. The mediation stretched for 2 grueling days. Sophia was a pit bull, conceding nothing. Evelyn sat silently, a monument of calm resolve, her strength drawn from the land waiting for her outside. The final settlement was not a total victory, but it was a life. A future. The fraudulent Lone Star debts were declared void and unenforceable. The legitimate, but hidden, debts were settled by liquidating Hank's remaining personal assets, his truck, a small investment portfolio Evelyn never knew about. The revised will was invalidated. The original will stood. The ranch, in its entirety, belonged to Evelyn. In exchange for dropping all claims and signing a confidentiality agreement, Jason, Melissa, and Kyle would receive a single, lump sum payment from a small life insurance policy Hank had outside the estate. It was a fraction of what they'd expected. A token. A severance. They signed the papers with faces like stone. They left Sterling that afternoon, likely for the last time. They would return to their worlds, their narrative of the bitter stepmother who stole their inheritance already taking shape. Evelyn found she didn't care a whit. The first real rain in months came the week after the settlement was finalized. Evelyn stood on her porch, watching it fall, a gentle, soaking rain that settled the dust and promised green grass. The air smelled of wet earth and hope. Sophia joined her, a cup of coffee in hand. "What now?" she asked. Evelyn looked out over her land. She saw Luis and his nephews moving the herd to fresh pasture. She saw Buck's truck parked by the equipment shed, where he was helping fix the old baler. She saw her legacy, scarred but intact. "Now," Evelyn said, a slow, sure smile touching her lips for the first time in a year, "we work. The fences on the south quarter need fixing before winter. And I've been thinking, that old bunkhouse would make a fine office for a certain lawyer who might want a quiet place to work away from the city sometimes." Sophia grinned. "I might just take you up on that." Evelyn Carter took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the clean, rain-washed air of home. The storm had passed. The land was hers. And she was no longer just Hank's widow. She was the keeper of the legacy, the center of a new, chosen family, and the undeniable, resilient heart of the Lazy E. The future, for the first time in a long time, was her own. The end.